a retired homicide detective. I've interviewed thousands of people, from serial killers to ministers. Welcome to the interview room. Welcome to the interview room, everybody, on this wonderful Sunday evening. We are so grateful that you're here, and boy, are we excited with our guests this evening. We want to thank all of our mods, Miss Sophia, Maui Girl, Mimi J2, and of course, Teresa M. And I know Miss Sophia wasn't feeling good tonight, but she's here anyway, and that dedication is why we absolutely love our mods, and in my opinion, we have the greatest on YouTube. We know there's a lot going on, but of course, you guys know us. We're not breaking news. We can't keep up with mainstream media or anything like that, but what we are is real information with real people about real cases. Let's get right into tonight's program. We have with us Neil Gordon. He is who co-wrote the book Behind the Doors of Justice, the Murdaugh Murders with Becky Hill. So Neil is the co-author, and Karen's going to hold his book up there right now with Becky. But he's got quite an impressive history and bio here. Neil has been in broadcast media for over 35 years. He spent 13 years in TV news, doing everything from reporting to news director. So hopefully he won't critique my opening here. Because
outstanding, Chris.
I love it. Thanks, Neil. He'd already pushed it over to another camera, but he spent another 13 years hosting a legal active program on CBS in Augusta, Georgia, where he and his family currently live. He's also the currently the publisher of a digital business journal, and all of Neil's information is going to be available to everybody tonight via his links that will be in the description below. If you have not read his book, his and Becky's book yet, get to Amazon as quickly as possible. And my sweetheart, Karen, who you know, has also been an investigative journalist for quite some time. So I'm going to take a different position here tonight. I'm going to let Neil and Karen kind of drive our conversation this evening. And Karen and I talked about it, and I just think that's the right thing to do. So this old cop is going to kind of sit in the background and watch these two journalists have a really great conversation, and I'll jump in as it goes along. So if you have questions, Neil said he'd be willing to take those questions towards the end of our conversation and answer them for you. We still believe this Murdaugh thing. There is more twists and turns than anybody can shake a stick at. But more importantly, there's also a lot of truth that isn't getting out there. And we wanted to go to Neil and hear it firsthand on some of the things that are going on. So with that, I'll turn it over to Miss Karen, my sweetheart, and honey, drive and tell us where we're going tonight.
All right. Well, thank you. And thanks everybody for being here tonight, and a warm welcome to Neil. We're very happy to have you. So let's just kind of catch everybody up. If you have not heard, I'm going to show this again. This is the book that set off a bunch of allegations post Alex Murdaugh's double murder trial. So Becky Hill is the co-author of this, and Becky is the Colleton County Clerk of Court in South Carolina. And so she's now at the center of this controversy that has arisen over allegations of jury tampering in Alex Murdaugh's case. She is not facing any criminal charges at this time. Everybody is proven innocent until guilty. And remember, there are two sides to every story. So Becky and Neil wrote this book post-trial. And if you've been following this, Alex Murdaugh's defense team made a big splash last week saying that after the book came out, they went back, interviewed or talked to jurors, and that's where all these alleged jury tampering allegations came from. So just to kind of catch everybody up before we dive into the book, let's just kind of go over of where we're at. So the defense team is accusing Becky of basically jury tampering, as I'm saying. So here, I'm just going to run through the list real quick of these allegations. She allegedly had one-on-one conversations with the jury foreperson, sometimes behind closed doors in a bathroom. She allegedly had asked jurors their opinions about Murdaugh's guilt or innocence. Excuse me. She told them not to believe evidence presented during the trial, including when Alex Murdaugh took the stand, his own testimony. She allegedly made up a story to the judge to get a juror remove the egg lady. It's in the book. We're going to talk about that. She apparently allegedly did this, believing that that person might not vote guilty during deliberations. She allegedly pressured jurors to reach a guilty verdict quickly so she could profit from it. And then she also allegedly told the jury not to be fooled by the evidence presented by the defense, to watch Murdaugh closely as he testified, and to look at his actions and look at his movements. So they have a long list. So the book came out, and as we know, the defense team is claiming all this, evidentiary. Thank you. An evidentiary, thank you, hearing is likely to take place where the evidence for these allegations are going to be laid out. And I think everybody is waiting for this because we all want to see some proof. Okay, so, and by the way, I think it's also worth noting that these allegations were from two jurors who signed an affidavit. There were 12 jurors. Actually, I should say there were 18 jurors, including the alternates. So these were from two of them.
And they're being represented by Eric Bland, one of them, right?
Well, a couple of them, yeah. Eric Bland has come out and given a couple of interviews saying that he is now representing some of the other jurors who apparently never saw any signs of this alleged tampering, private conversations, anything of the like. So clearly, this all needs to be fleshed out at some point. So we bought the interview room, bought the book.
Thank you.
We read it. Our pleasure. We read it. And I have to tell everybody, by the time I got to chapter 4 in this book, I had an aha moment. So that's what I want to kind of start with. So in the book, Becky Hill, as clerk of the court, she had obviously interactions all the time with the judge, with the defense team, with the prosecution, and of course the jurors. And I won't go into all the details, but if you get the book, she lays out very nice, and you do a good job too, Neil, of her responsibilities. Okay, so by the time I got to chapter 4, she is critical of Jim Griffin. That's one of Alex Murdaugh's defense attorneys. So I started thinking, this is kind of interesting. And I want to just share a bit of this, not to kind of belabor it. So she's critical of him in many ways. And she also talks about, and you do, the contraband in the courtroom incident. If you guys remember, Alex Murdaugh's family was seated in the seated in the courtroom during the trial. Alex's sister Lynn apparently handed a book to the defense's paralegal. She gave it to Alex, and then if you guys remember, the bomb scare was called in to the courthouse. All that went on. Alex took the book, and after Judge Newman was had choice words for everybody about this, he was very upset about it. But the part I wanted to read in their book, is on page 31. So this just jumped out at me. It's my theory.
Follow along with you.
Follow along, and we'll get to questions, I promise, Neil.
Oh, that's okay.
So I want you guys to hear it, and then I'm going to share my thought on this. So, okay. So Becky writes, perhaps the biggest challenge Jim Griffin had was with his client, Alex. It was clear to me from hearing courthouse conversations that Murdaugh was calling the shots. Behind closed doors and private conversations with different members of the legal community, Alex was like an extra lawyer on his own case. He would give different requests and orders to his attorneys. Those orders included Alex's decision to take the witness stand against his counsel's advice. That frustrated Jim. It came out in recorded jailhouse call that accidentally was released to the media. On the call, Murdaugh was trying to discuss strategy with Jim, and Jim repeatedly was trying to get off the phone. He didn't feel well. He wanted to call his wife, go to sleep. During the podcast, Jim explained that this was about the fifth call from Alex that night. The frustration would eventually boil over leading up to the very end of the trial. So she goes on and she says, Jim Griffin was pushed throughout the trial by his client. He was caught in an unpleasant place to be with the whole world watching. As Jim Griffin delivered his closing argument, it appeared very robotic to me and many others watching in the courtroom and online. So Becky is very critical of Jim Griffin in the book. Neil, my question to you is, could these allegations be, at least in part, some kind of retaliation from the defense?
Hard to say, Karen, if it's retaliation, but to use his own words at Tuesday's press conference, he said jury members were angry at reading the book. I don't know whether he was angry. I will tell you, we heard through a third party that he wasn't particularly happy with some of the things that were written. You mentioned that there was definitely some behind the scenes things that were going on that made Jim very, very nervous. He had contracted with an IT provider that you might have heard his name throughout. People would say, Doug, can I have this slide or that slide? And he would put it up for everyone to see in the gallery and, of course, streaming. And there tended to be some friction as time went on between those sides. And we reached back to this gentleman, Doug Brown, and asked him about it. And he shared with us that Jim was extremely nervous and agitated, and he thought it was because Alex was pressing buttons to try to get certain things pushed across for Jim. And although there's controversy as to who wrote the closing arguments, you really could tell if you watched it closely that it was a different Jim Griffin. Did the both of you feel that way as you were watching it, that there was something a little different?
Yeah, I mean, when I saw it, Neil, it was pretty interesting because I always had the feeling, well, watching the trial and quite frankly, even commenting on the trial and, in the public arena, that I just couldn't help but think he's not going to let go of that much control, especially when it implied that his future destiny. Right. So to answer your question, yeah, I sense his style, the way he answered questions on the stand was really, I think it played a role in the closing argument and how that closing argument was written. You could almost, if you were to lay over, you get kind of a flavor of how Alex spoke. And so you would think, okay, well, does he write this way? What I thought was really interesting as well is the allegation of, these jurors that comes up now. And Karen had made a point when we were talking, that think there's any funny business going on behind the scenes, like the cousin. The cousin was paid, Cousin Eddie, as everybody used to call him, was paid to shoot Alex. And then there was this long history of rumors and all this other stuff,
Sure.
long before the trial ever started, that, this family had run that court system for quite some time. And, it wasn't, they never lost a verdict, and there's always a question on, is that true? Is it, rumor? Is it just, folklore? So all of a sudden, two jurors pop up in the, at the, your book comes out and Becky's book comes out, and next thing you know it, there are two jurors who are signing affidavits, and you go, wait a minute, is there more here? Because what happened to the other 10? Did that, Karen?
Exactly. Well, and Becky, she didn't hold back on criticism of Jim Griffin in the book. If you remember, for all those who watched the trial extremely closely, that Jim Griffin during the trial had retweeted something that was retweeted something from the news media that said that Jim's cross-examination showed a sloppy investigation by SLED during the trial. And Judge Newman was very upset. And in open court, he took Jim to task. And I think at first Jim's comments he kind of shrugged it off. And then Judge Newman came back and made a larger point about, no, it's much more serious than that. And I think that's where Jim apologized in open court, said he wouldn't be doing that again. And so, I just think there's many points in this book where Becky, she's an insider. She was there, and she expresses her feelings based on facts. She's laying out facts about Jim Griffin. And I couldn't help but think, is this a personal, payback of some sort, some kind of a retribution thing here?
Well, you know how y'all are one of dozens of excellent podcasts, and we were just scrolling around trying to just take the temperature of what was happening after the trial and the commentary and such. And we came upon a podcast that Jim did with Sarah Azuri, who's I believe a former criminal defense attorney, and I don't know if she's appeared on your program, but she's appeared on others. And they were on with Seton Tucker, and I know his last name is Harris, and I don't want to say his wrong first name, but the Harris and Tucker Impact of Influence podcast. And the two of them together went back and forth. And it was the beauty of podcasting is they probably didn't realize they were being recorded, and they were just having a conversation amongst each other. And they really disrespected the judge, and they disrespected Becky and the court and the whole system and the whole process, because they felt it really wasn't a big deal for people to mouth words to Alex, for people to come up and hug Alex, to do a high five with Alex, even the book kind of thing. And that is not allowed in any courtroom. And they literally said, do y'all have a 5-second delay?
No, we're listening.
No? All right. Well, I don't know if I should cuss, but
it's a family show.
Okay. All right. They basically said that's bull blank.
Right.
that they shouldn't, that he hasn't seen him in a while, like it's a family reunion. And there was it gave Becky the impression that the rules just didn't apply to that side of the courthouse. And we put it in the book.
Yeah. So I want to touch on one of the defense team's claims right now is they say this Facebook post, the story of this Facebook post, and I just want to, I think it's easiest. Obviously, Becky isn't out making any public statements for the media,
Sure.
but the words in the book, I think,
Yes,
are a good second best. And so the defense has made a lot about this. They claim she made up this Facebook post story, and I want everybody to hear her side of how she characterizes this. So again, I'm back in their books. Okay. This is in chapter 12. Becky says, working with jurors is always a unique experience. And like with any jury, we had some behind the scenes happenings with our jurors, alternates, and the originals throughout the trial. While most of the jurors were focused and engaged during the trial, we did have one juror who was an alternate at one point who was not. And then she goes on to say that, this person was doing some other things, nothing to get bumped off, but just distracted. And then she writes, she says, then there was the egg lady juror, which our audience that followed the trial knows exactly what the story is. So this juror worked on a monkey farm in the Low Country, and she drove Judge Newman bananas one weekend, pun intended.
That was my line.
Very good.
Well done.
All right, so she says, through the Facebook page called Walterboro Word of Mouth, about 20,000 followers saw this juror's ex-husband post about how she was talking way too much to friends and family about the case. Many people became aware of the situation after court on Friday, February 24th, and it was brought to the attention of Judge Newman. I typically didn't have the time or energy to watch any media coverage of the trial, but on that Friday night, I scrolled through the Walterboro Word of Mouth social media feed and saw the post from the ex-husband, but he didn't mention the juror's name or her juror number. At the time, I didn't think anything of it and kept scrolling. And then she goes on to say, when Monday morning came, Judge Newman asked me to find the social media post. One of our techies in the office looked for it, couldn't find it. Luckily, she kept looking, saw the post was taken down and replaced with an apology from the juror's ex-husband. He said, quote, Satan had gotten a hold of him and he had been drinking at the time. He posted and now he was sorry. So after Judge Newman interviewed the juror and corroborated witnesses about the situation, he removed the juror from the jury before the court started that Monday morning. And then she goes on to say, when a juror is removed from the jury, it's normal practice for the judge to ask if there's any personal items that you'd like to get. When Judge Newman graciously presented this question to the former juror, she said she just wanted to get her eggs, which caused some laughter in the courtroom. Even Judge Newman broke out into a smile. One of the other jurors, here's the explanation. One of the other jurors raised chickens on their farm and had brought in a dozen eggs to whoever wanted them. This time, eggs were selling for about $8 a dozen, which was very expensive. So it was understandable why this removed juror wanted her eggs. Okay, so she does talk, she says this is what happened for the Facebook post. So we have her saying that, hey, we went back, it was, missing. The defense did point out in theirs, and then we're going to kind of move on to something else, but they pointed out that there was a Timothy Stone who was not to be confused with Tim Stone, who was the ex-husband of one of these jurors. So anyway, putting it out there for everybody. Neil, if you feel free to add anything, you want to mention anything more about this?
Sure. So during and we did 4 months of different interviews, and during the process of that, there really wasn't anything out of the ordinary. The only thing that struck me that was interesting was that Becky mentioned to me that she just happened to catch it scrolling. I mean, she was just exhausted. and, trying to sleep on the weekends because she basically worked 14, 16 hours a day from sunup to sundown and then beyond. And the part that, actually was the most significant was what happened one morning before court began. And the judge came out and mentioned that he had spoken to the egg lady and that he had spoken to some witnesses that confirmed that the egg lady had spoken about portions of the case. And that was it. I mean, I never got any sense that there was anything out of the ordinary with Becky, never speaking to the person or anything unusual about the post. Posts come and go all the time, of course. So I suppose that is for the investigators to go back on the computer and see if somebody deleted it or not. But I have no idea.
Okay. No, we appreciate that. And so along those lines, when you guys were putting the book together, did she ever relate anything to you about speaking with the four-person or the jury four-person who was obviously a woman? Did she mention anything like that? Any sense of camaraderie or just anything anecdotally about that?
Not at all. I mean, there were a few conversations she mentioned to me that one of the female jurors was in need of some feminine products. And so behind the scenes, they were trying to figure who might go to the local CVS to pick something up. And then one of her staff members had some of the products in her desk drawer, and I don't know if the forelady was involved in that, but there was that. Another female juror had some anxiety issues, and so there may have been some discussions that way. But what I do know is she relied very heavily on her chief bailiff. I believe it's Bill Polk, to really watch carefully and interact carefully with the jurors.
Yeah, I mean, you would think with this list of allegations that somebody within the courthouse, such as the bailiff, would have seen something, said something. Even if Judge Newman hadn't seen it, one would think that this would have surfaced with another source.
That's right. Yeah. And as you mentioned, I think at the top, it's so really important not to rush to judgment because it's so fluid. I mean, we're doing this live Sunday at 7 p.m. and I'm watching Court TV and News Nation Friday night, and Eric Bland comes on, and I think I'm paraphrasing this correctly. He said, 2 jurors, both of them have completely different stories than the ones that filed affidavits, mentioning no discussions about what's alleged with Becky. And he said, what would happen if at the end of the day, there's those 2 jurors, and then there's 10 more that say didn't happen? So like you, I just caution people to be careful in rushing to judgment. I mean, Alex Murdaugh was innocent till proven guilty. And based on Becky's track record and all the accolades that she got at the end of the trial for her hard work, really over a period of about 6 months, doesn't she deserve to be innocent until proven guilty? I mean, that's just the American way to me.
Yeah, interesting. I agree with you 1,000%, and that is the American way, right? I mean, the presumption of innocence went towards Alex during the trial, and now post-trial, all these allegations have surfaced, and the irony here is, here's a guy like 2 weeks before this really started to surface, is reprimanded by the state of South Carolina for violating the rules within the prison by utilizing, prisoners' tablets to make, recordings for his attorney, Jim. And Jim is even reprimanded by the state to the point where the state says, if you do that again, you will not have any more visits with your client here.
Mm-hmm.
And that is a pretty hard hammer to drop, on a nail. So, and next thing you know, your book is in the environment, and all of a sudden, 2 jurors appear on the horizon here to say, "Hey, yeah, we'll sign an affidavit for you, Harpootlian and Jim Griffith." Now we're going to give them the benefit of the doubt, but quite frankly, they've already been reprimanded by the state for violating the rules. Mm-hmm. And when does it stop with this Murdaugh case? When does the law get to be the law, i.e., the appeals process, and all of this grandstanding, from a lot of different people in every different direction? Whereas I have a question: did Becky ever clerk when Alex was in the courtroom before he was convicted? Oh,
yes.
She did.
So she had been a clerk November of 2020. There's a possibility it's either that or several times before. For 14 years, she was a traveling clerk of court within the district.
Okay.
And many times was in the courtroom with Alex and Alex's dad, they call Handsome, but Randolph. So there were, many interactions that they had. And in the book, and the part that people, when they read it, went, "Oh dear, that must have been awkward," is every morning Alex would come in just like he would have years ago, trying a case with Becky as clerk of court reporter. "Hi, Miss Becky, how are you today?" And Becky didn't want to be rude, and she responded back, "Fine, thank you for asking," and then moved on. Kind of awkward.
Yeah, most definitely. Yeah, no, I just want to be thorough, Neil, with asking you the questions that I know a lot of people have. And again, hitting these allegations up,
Sure.
Straight on. Did she ever talk to you about having conversations with the jurors, asking them to express their opinions on guilt or innocence during the trial? Did that ever come up?
No, we did speak about Mozelle, which was listed. I think it was Dick who said he observed maybe her off to the side or something like that. We had discussed in depth, almost right away, like when it was fresh. March 20th was the first day that we sat down and did an interview. And I had it in my nutty journalist's head that we would start the book with Mozelle. And smarter editors than me said, no, start with guilty, 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 guilty. So in my mind, that was the first thing. And she was very clear. And this will show you, I think, give you an example of just how reverent she is to the rules. She said, not allowed. It was quiet. It was eerily quiet the entire time. I mean, it was just quiet. And of course, the judge had mentioned he didn't want any conversations going on. So nothing in relation to Mozelle, and nothing. Would have no idea. Love to listen back to, and I probably will need to at some point preserve our interview tapes, because whatever we discussed about the jury or Mozelle, it's all there.
Yeah, I would find that really hard to believe, because the way it was explained, not just in the media coverage, but in your book, and you go into detail, is that the jurors were in two separate vans at the front of this procession. Okay. Then you had Judge Newman and his staff in a separate vehicle. Becky was in another vehicle. So everybody and everybody's traveling to and from in separate vehicles.
Right.
With Judge Newman's no talking at Mozelle, there was no conversations. People were kind of walking around, and you guys describe it as, eerily, and Becky has a few of her own observations of, whether she could feel the victims, Paul
Right.
and Maggie's, spirit lingering there, etc. And so what she described, there would not be any opportunity to have a private conversation. If one happened, you would have had Judge Newman, his staff, the bailiffs, the prosecution, the defense. This would have been seen by everybody there. So it's extraordinary. It would be extraordinarily, highly unlikely that a conversation took place between any two people out on that property during that visit. Am I wrong?
No, I think you're right about that. And I think I saw an interview with Joe McCullough, might have been over the weekend, and he said it would be tough, and if there was anything, his interpretation would have been, it may have been, all right, you want to get the jurors back together to go back, because remember, they had to go back. But even he didn't think, and he was highly complimentary of Becky. He was there every single day. And by the way, he said he never witnessed anything. He was there almost, other than being on Law and Crime Network, he was in the courtroom.
I suspect there's going to be a videotape of that jury visit as well, meaning from the PD side, the sheriff's.
Good point about that. I do know there was, was there a pool video camera? I know there was a pool photographer, and Valerie Bauerlein from Wall Street Journal was chosen as the pool reporter. So you may be right, Chris. It may have been, I don't know if it'd be a body cam or some other video company, maybe. I'm not really sure about that.
Well, the court would want, just listen to Judge Newman. The court would want to make sure that entire process, with him being there, was as pure as, white, the white snow, right? And so typically what happens behind the scenes is they meet with the sheriff's security. And remember, they had a lot of that shut down, not to the location, but at the location. And, those body cameras are on, and that bailiff and those deputies are told right up front, if you see anything, immediately, let the judge know. Because that could be, as that's going on, if two jurors are talking, even at that scene visit, that could be a mistrial.
That's true.
Right then and there.
We kind of lived a little bit on the edge in that particular chapter, because I thought it was so important. Becky did lock eyes with the jury. It's in the book, the jurors, that it's just one of those women's intuition, if that's a fair thing to say, that she just locked eyes with many different people who were there. And it was just one of those, I wasn't there, so I don't know. It's just kind of like, you just knew, kind of a look, but it wasn't conveyed, as far as I know, it was not conveyed orally. Again, I was not there.
Right.
And then and then another part that could have confused the defense as well is that Becky did, as Chris mentioned, as your bride mentioned, that Becky did ride back in another vehicle. I believe the chief deputy was with her. one of the police investigators and someone else from her clerk of court's office. I'm not mistaken. I think it was 4. And, you know, they're human beings at that point. I mean, you know, they're not robots, and they just were like, that was heavy. And then they just started to, you know, talk a little amongst themselves.
Right.
But that's all.
Right. Yeah, of course, giving somebody a look with your eyes is far, far different,
Yeah.
obviously, than having a conversation, mentioning something offhand, or what have you. So yeah, that one is going to obviously be looked at. But yeah, I agree that there's going to be a lot of people to interview regarding that, because there was such a huge contingent of people who were visiting Mozelle at that point. Yeah.
That's right.
I want to jump over to another point of, I don't know if it's criticism or not, but let's just talk for a minute about the South Carolina Ethics Commission, Neil,
Mhm.
on whether or not Becky should have even written a book to begin with. And so we know that she sent an email, the South Carolina Ethics Commission gave a response, and then you had shared with us that your attorney for the book gave an opinion about this as well. So I think it kind of helps to clear things up or add a little more, shed a little more light on this. And let's talk about that for a minute, if you can do that.
And I thank you for mentioning that earlier when we were discussing some sort of topics for the program. So I went back, and you know, this is going back to around May, and our attorney gave an opinion, and I jotted down what he said to us in the email, and I'm quoting him, and I don't want to share his name to draw any attention to him, but he said, let's see here, the writing of a book, even one based on your experience as clerk of court during the Murdaugh trial, does not come within the definition of official capacity, because the writing of a book is not within your official responsibility as clerk of court, nor a service your office would normally provide. So this is just kind of an outlier situation, and I'll share with you, we didn't know what the Ethics Commission was going to say. We didn't know if they were going to say, "Hey, you can't." You know, we looked at the statute. Everyone told us it was very vague, and we didn't know whether they said no, you know, would say no or what have you. But they did explain that, and then they were very careful with guidelines, and our attorney reaffirmed that, not to share confidential information. So, you know, our title of the book is Behind the Doors of Justice, but they're really just tidbits of Becky's recollections, really almost streams of consciousness of what she saw, like no one would know what those 4 people in the van, including her, would have been thinking having just been to the crime scene. That's not confidential. Confidential would have been, hey, here are the exhibits, and you know, here are different things that are sealed documents or what have you. So that's the line. That's what we got out of the Ethics Commission response.
Okay.
So I have a question along those lines.
Yeah.
Do you know if anybody that served in the defense capacity was talking about writing a book post verdict? Were you approached by anybody else other than Becky to write with them?
No, I was not. Excuse me. I'm sorry. I was not although I've been approached by other people for sure. Eric Bland, I know, was considering writing a book. Eric and Jim have their own podcasts, of course. Yep. There are some people who maybe used to work for the government there in Colleton County that have been thinking about it, and I've heard they may want to speak with me, but no, I like, for instance, Jim Griffin or Harpoolian, or I've not at all. But it's well within the rights.
Oh yeah. I mean, most definitely. I mean, when OJ was done, everybody wrote a book, right? I mean, just even the DA. So, all those books are coming. It's just a matter of time. It just looks like yours hit the shelves first, and you're now catching some heat on that. But
fair. And I watched the interview, and actually on Court TV Friday, it was interesting. Eric Bland and Joe McCullough were on together, and Joe McCullough said, "I don't have a problem with it," and Eric Bland said, "I wish Becky would have waited through the appeal." I wonder now with Judge Newman having been on the NBC Today show over the summer, with appeal pending, will that be a problem? So I totally understand, and I'm a big boy, and I can understand an awful lot of criticism we've faced for the timing of the book. And when you've been in the media world as long as I know, you live by deadline and you live by timeliness. Right. And if you wait a year, you probably miss your window. And we hustled faster than anyone thought we could. And our whole goal when we started seriously talking about it, Chris, in late April, was we knew the boat trial was coming.
Yep.
And we just figured, let's do everything that we can to put out what we have to put out before this next wave takes over. And then, of course, you hustle. The book comes out, exhale, and then, they settled.
Right. And I don't know. I know the public understands most of that, but as Karen says, when the story has legs, it's moving. Right.
Well, let me just also jump in here. One of the allegations by the defense team was that Becky wanted to hurry up and get her book deal with a publisher. It has to be noted, and Neil and I, when we talked offline, this book is self-published. Okay, anybody can see that when you open the book and you look in here, and it says published by, and it has an LLC name. Okay, who's the LLC? You get to the back of the book, and in the credits, you guys explain that the LLC was created by you, Neil, and Becky Hill in order to publish this book. That's right. This is on Amazon. So there's no Random House, anybody involved. Okay, so I want to make that clear.
And
get that book. Go get the book, though.
Get the book. Yeah.
You guys will, and Neil, you gave an interview that said you guys put a sizable amount of your own money out in order to get this thing self-published. So the notion that Becky got some kind of an advance to write her book is just rubbish. It didn't happen.
It is.
This is a self-published book. Okay. And it's there wasn't an advance.
Not at all.
Any thoughts on that?
Well, it irked me when he said that. I couldn't believe it as I was watching him, and I'm like, well, where's my big check then? I mean, I sure missed out. And it should be said, Valerie Bauerlein got an advance from the Wall Street Journal. She's been working on it. Jason Ryan.
Wait, let me just interrupt. So in the book, you guys mentioned that. So Valerie is a reporter for the Wall Street Journal.
Right.
She has an advance from, I believe it's Penguin Random House.
Yes.
And her book is coming out in October. She's a journalist. It's going to be a
Yes.
completely different slant, different
Yes.
perspective, obviously, than your book.
Yeah, a lot of deep dive, Karen, into the history and the background of the Murdaughs and the allegations of a lot of corruption and jury tampering and bootlegging and the whiskey business and all sorts. And so there, maybe they were just confused by the other journalists getting advances to do books. And there's a lot of books that are coming, believe me, and have already come out. But to hang your hat that Becky allegedly tampered with jurors based upon the motivation that she could be the puppet master to get a certain verdict within a certain time so that she could get a particular payday. Wow. That's pretty deep and pretty false in my humble opinion, because there was no book deal. In fact, we couldn't even until the ethics commission weighed in and our attorney weighed in, and we're in early May at that point. So think about that. That's 2 months after the trial. So that should tell you something.
Sure. I also want to touch on something else that the defense made a big deal. They made a very big deal that Becky shared after the trial that she went to New York City with some of the jurors who they were on the national TV shows. I don't believe she was interviewed. Am I right?
Not. You're correct about that. There were three jurors. That's right. 2 women and 1 gentleman.
So in her explanation of it in the book, it really struck me as more like a small town girl who was very enamored with the TV spotlight. She was kind of taken with all these national media types, their personalities, how they came in. She mentions it was her first time flying on an airplane.
Yes.
Now she's over age 50. So nothing wrong with that. She's a small town Southern girl, first time on an airplane. So I read that as, rather than someone seeking their fortune, as the defense is making it out to be, somebody who's kind of starry-eyed with TV and kind of a little bit swept away by all this, but not in an improper or illegal type of anything.
No, you're right.
Did you get that sense?
Yes, okay. Karen, it was the Monday after that the 3 jurors were on the Today Show. So Friday was the sentencing, and of course that powerful 20-minute talking to that Clifton Newman, the Honorable Clifton Newman, gave to Alex Murdaugh. And then over the weekend, it was a rush. And, anyone who knows Becky, she's extremely close to her family. She has a daughter by the name of Aubrey who has a lot of talent singing and is just a really great person. She got to take a +1, and she decided to take her daughter. And they got to go to, Madison Avenue and be down by Times Square. And you're right. She'd never been to New York, never been on a plane. This was a big deal. And it created some anxiety. I mean, my wife's first plane ride was to New York City, being there too. Talk about sensory overload. It was just one of those bucket list things. And, if people are going to criticize her for that, I'm sorry, but because it was all finished. So I think that I don't even know if you'd call that official capacity. That'd be a good question. It's after they're off, and it's after after the trial.
Well, you're right. It is after the fact. And again, there isn't the narrative that they want to promulgate. It doesn't exist. We just shot a hole in it because this is a self-published book. There isn't an advance. She wasn't offered money in advance to do this. This is a project you guys put your own money out in for. And anyway, this trip with the jurors was after the trial.
That's right.
I do want to go on and mention a couple more things. I thought it was interesting, the behind the doors with Judge Newman. There were a few things that I thought were super interesting, that, were anecdotal, but listen, we all watched the trial and we came to love and respect Judge Newman. I called him America's favorite judge. And I mean, I'm sure other people would say the same thing. I'm not saying I'm coining any new phrase here, but
it kind of reminds me, and believe me, I'm not comparing, but you remember back in the day when Bill Cosby had a wonderful reputation. Remember with the Huxtables? Yeah. He was America's favorite dad, so America's favorite. That's okay. It just made me think of that. But anyway, you're right.
Yeah. And so everybody saw this real, this, I'm going to quote Chris, because my husband, with all of his great Chrisisms, he uses the term firm, fair, and friendly in a lot of things. But I think Judge Newman went beyond that. I mean, for a lot of us, some of the media tells us this is the trial of the century, and certainly that's a reference in your book. Well, the last trial of the century we all watched, those of us who were around, was of course the O.J. Simpson trial. And Judge Ito had no control. He lost control of his courtroom in most of our opinions, with the antics and everything that was able to go on. And here we see this respected, kind of quiet, very dignified man who ran that courtroom, and he had to deal with what we're now seeing, right? The Dick Harpootlian, Jim Griffin, and all this other stuff. So he was beloved and respected by people. That's why I thought what you guys included in the book was interesting. Yes. And I'm going to touch on a couple of those. And again, if you guys, the book, it's a good read. It really is a good read. I mean, there's a few criticisms to point out, of course, but there's a lot of interesting things in there. So Judge Newman had considered sequestering the jury. I thought that was interesting. I had never read anything. Certainly Judge Newman's a very private man. We did all know that he lost his 40-year-old son very tragically just a few weeks before the trial started. So of course your heart goes out to him. Chris and I know what it's like to lose a child, and an adult child. So I appreciate that. So Judge Newman, just maybe he rose even higher in our esteem because we knew of that backstory that we didn't hear anything about. So, she also talks about, how he took time off. Judge Newman, stopped all communication with people for a couple of weeks just to go through the grieving process privately with his family. But in terms of the jury, and that he had considered whether or not to stay on the bench for the Murdaugh trial. I thought that was really interesting. Can you tell us anything more about that?
Yeah. In the end, it ended up, he did have conversations about that with the Chief Justice in the state of South Carolina. And we learned that, in essence, the Chief Justice felt the judge could compartmentalize this trial versus the awful tragedy, and actually felt as though it would be helpful to Judge Newman. And as a safeguard or two, Judge Newman's beautiful wife, who's been by his side for decades, who almost never went to a trial that he was presiding over, was there every day.
Wow.
Yeah. And Judge Newman's daughter, who is a judge, was there some of the time. Not to be forgotten, there's 2 other sons that he has. I believe they're both involved sort of in the science and technology fields, not in the law, like his late son and his only daughter. And so you mentioned about, Karen, the sequestration, and that was a real thing. And so she had to, and you have to remember, she had never been through a trial like this. She had only been a clerk of court for a few years. So she actually traveled to Florence and traveled to other cities to kind of pick the brain of some of her peers and her colleagues. And she decided to put plans together that she believed would be best for this particular case based upon the input of so many other people. And then she presented it to the judge. I mean, she didn't talk to him until Sunday night before jury roll call on Monday. And so they had some fast and furious conversations, and the judge was very complimentary, and in the end decided against the sequestration, but they had talked about it for weeks. And so Becky went around. There's not too many hotels in Walterboro, but they had chosen the Microtel. And we talk a little bit about this, just the sweet couple that ran the Microtel and how Becky did her best to make them whole, because they had to hold rooms because it was touch and go about whether the jurors were going to end up staying there. And it was, if you've ever been in situations like that where, and she's calling her up, Miss Becky, I'm going to be losing money, Miss Becky. And Miss Becky says, I understand. We'll, so I think they ended up writing a check to her for like $3,000 or $4,000 to try to be helpful afterwards, kind of thing. But in lieu of sequestering them, there was a partial sequestration where they ended up having them drive to what I think is kind of like a gate, the back of sort of a civic center in town, a small venue that was gated. So they would all go in, put the code in, they'd park, and then they'd get into these vans, and then they'd come into the back door kind of thing. So that was kind of the next best thing.
Interesting. This is a little off topic, but I just want to kind of throw this out there for what we're seeing in the news. Judge Newman, and you talk about this in the book, he made a very smart decision to allow cameras in the courtroom. And I know that the laws are such that they're different in every state. We're seeing other trials coming up, certainly with the accused killer Brian Koberger out in Idaho. And there's much discussion going on, and it's going on at other trials too, but certainly that one has such huge public interest that we saw Judge Newman, cameras in the courtroom. Of course, media people, we always want cameras in the courtroom. And there's always going to be that, the push and pull. But here's a trial. Okay. Now, obviously, we're talking about post-trial and allegations and all that, but that has nothing to do with how successful cameras in the courtroom were. And you talk about it in your book. And I think this is a really good case for it can work. It can work successfully. And I know in the book you talk about how the judge laid out the rules for the reporters, the media, and the public. And they couldn't have laptops. They couldn't be typing away. They couldn't be doing email and that kind of stuff. They had to take that outside of the courtroom. But here's an example of how it worked really well. And everybody was served. It did end up being a win-win-win. Any more thoughts on that topic? Well,
at the very beginning, some members of the media were a bit ticked off. I think the word dinosaurish came up or something. Are we living in the dinosaur ages? What do you mean we have to use pen and paper? can't we even just have our computers so that we can type or what have you? We could turn our phones off. And it just wasn't allowed. And of course, they set up a makeshift media room where folks, could get wired in and send tweets, and they could also file stories, upload, download photos, etc. Boy, I tell you, we've got Animal Kingdom here, don't we? That's my French behind me.
We love it. We absolutely love it. Our
We're good
audience
with
loves it. The chat's going to go crazy because they're going to see Frenchie behind. Who is this, by the way? We need an introduction.
Her name is Bindi, and my
Okay.
daughter's name is Lindy. She'll be 10, and Bindi just had six puppies.
Oh,
and
wow.
She's precious. And the thing that we love about, you always say dogs give you unconditional love. Well, Frenchies, I mean, they slobber all over you. That's all they know.
Yeah,
That's awesome.
that's awesome.
Yeah.
So don't worry about
Oh, good.
Bindi. So this is great. So finish your thought.
Yeah. So it was a great media experience for everyone. And I thought that the judge had hired through the county an old neighbor of his from Columbia, Jay Bender, who taught at the University of South Carolina, is retired now. And I think he was the president of the South Carolina Media Association. And so I thought they retained him. And when we were reviewing everything with Jay, and he said, "Oh, you'll have to change that." I volunteered. So he was there sun up to sundown for 6 weeks. And you couldn't put anything by him because he had been there, done that for decades. And everyone had a respect for his humble way. And he was an extension of Judge Newman in trying to, and Judge Newman was so clear from the beginning. If the bailiffs and the judge and the witnesses and the attorneys and all, everybody has a job to do. Why can't the media do their job? He was just black and white.
Interesting.
Yeah, and when I read about him in the book, to me he was kind of like the public information officer in a maybe a little bit more casual way that was brought in. This is a media guy. He knew what the media needed. He was respected by the judge and the court, and obviously knows his way around the courtroom. And so he was kind of a liaison, which was a very smart move, because then everything goes smoother when the media can get what they want. And now I'm speaking, I'm a former PIO myself. I did that for a number of years for a police agency. And so, when you can help the media do their job and then they can just go do it, it's smoother,
And circling back to Becky as it relates to that, typically, in trials, you don't have the benefit of a PIO or a Jay Bender. That would have fallen one more thing onto Becky's shoulders. And she helped. I mean, she was the friend of the media. I mean, every media person loved Becky, but she didn't have to make those minute by minute decisions of who's getting into the courtroom, who's sitting where, who needs some, food over in the, Jay took care of a lot of that.
Right. And actually, you bring up a good point, too. And maybe we just touch on this for a second. If you listen to Dick Harpootlian, Becky's job was to get people food and water. Well, clearly, was a way more to it than this. And just, Neil, just explain a little bit of that to people, just to kind of just put a finer point on that about what her liaison role was.
Well, here's a biggie, and people did not know that and know this. And I think we touched upon it a little. I don't know if we had a photo of it, but she was responsible to oversee the exhibits and the evidence on a day-to-day basis. And Chris, you could probably speak to this from your decades of being in law enforcement, police and such, but this was actually set up behind a brick wall to where Alex was staying in the holding cell. It was another jail cell, if you will. and it was set up, and it had to be every day put back carefully, and new exhibits that were being called. And this was done at the end of a long day and a long night. So that's just one. Conferences with Judge Newman on what Judge Newman needed, dealing with both the prosecution and the defense attorneys. She has a staff of, I want to say, with the bailiffs, a little bit over 10. So there's that. She came up with a badge system for the public. There were 234 possible seats on a daily basis, of which half of which could go to the general public, but it had to be organized in a certain way. She had to deal with the family, and this we dealt with in the book, the family of Alex Murdaugh, who requested, now remember, they're considered victims in this because their family members were killed. Right. Also, even though Alex is the brother of John Marvin, lost a mother, lost a sister-in-law and lost a nephew. And so that was very interesting. She was asked to make accommodations for the family, get a private deputy to bring them to and from for security reasons. They requested a private room. They requested a private bathroom. So there were, and then on top of it, the sister, Lynn, Alex's sister, just to add another layer, is a victim's advocate in the Charleston area. So she kind of knows the ins and outs on behalf of the victim. And so she tried, and we mentioned this in the book, she really tried everybody's patience, including the judge, with all of the requests that she had and all the times that the judge went back and said, listen, you fist bump him one more time and you're going to be fist bumping outside of the courtroom. That kind of stuff. I mean, it got pretty intense.
Well, the interesting thing about what you're talking about here, just to add a little color to it, from my experience, is the smaller communities and counties that have never ever experienced anything of this magnitude. It is really a hustle to put people into positions in terms of who's going to do what as the trial gets closer and closer. Nobody anticipates 100 satellite trucks outside of a county courthouse. If you've never ever been in a large media market, I mean, where Karen and I came from, with the Los Angeles, San Diego media market, I mean, it's just, I stepped out of a case one time with 13 satellite trucks, right there. And we hadn't even solved it yet. And so that volume of understanding comes quickly. And so the courts are positioned for that, recognizing these things happen. But in this case, they didn't have any of this, pre-positioned in terms of what Becky was going to do, what her role is. I mean, usually the clerk of the court is looking for evidence, making sure that the judge is, getting the proper paperwork, stamping, admitting, managing, that kind of thing. And the bailiff is handling 100% of the time the jury, and 150% of the time the jury. That everything goes through the bailiff to the jury, and the jury to the bailiff, back to the judge. Okay. But in this case, Becky was and I'm not defending or, saying it's right or wrong, but the defense knows what the rules are. So does the prosecution. And every defendant is, again, I always reiterate this, is presumed innocent. The jury has to look at this defendant, Alex Murdaugh, whether we like him or not, and say he's innocent until the burden of proof is established by the prosecution. And then it's presented to the jury. They make a decision. We get a verdict, and then we ultimately get a sentencing. Okay? But
I forgot.
Yeah,
You mentioned you step outside satellite trucks. I forgot probably the most important role that she had in coordinating with. Now they have a city police force and a county sheriff's office,
Right.
and as you may recall, there was a sniper that walked into a Charleston church years ago and murdered parishioners.
Right. Emmanuel Church.
That's right. And then
killed 9 people.
And that's right, 9 people. And then they had the trial, and there was a serious amount of security around because they were afraid people were going to take shots at him. Yep. And she, and then, same thing. This is the Murdaugh family. So there was an awful lot of thought put into security, walkie-talkies, and, deputies placed in certain areas, a deputy walking with the family at all times, looking around. I mean, it was, and there were people protesting with signs and things like that. So that was touch and go. And then some other important little administrative stuff like, oh yeah, where are people going to park
right
when they come in? And, oh, wait a minute, we're a small town. We don't have too many restaurants. Maybe we could put some food trucks, and somebody has to organize, so there were I call her, first of all, I believe she's grace under fire. She is built for the juggle. That's just her. Some people are not, and you'd never know that, it's getting a little bit, hot or difficult. You'd never know it. Never let her, never let you see you sweat.
Well, then you have another dynamic.
Yeah.
You and Karen, what do you think about this? Because you now have the Southern charm dynamic where everybody is polite, everybody is considerate, everybody is, just Southern charm. I mean, it is what it is. But what was interesting, what you said, I did not realize that Alex's sister was a victim's advocate in Charleston, over there in
it's a Dorchester
County.
I think is right on the perimeter of Charleston.
Yeah, we used to live in Mount Pleasant, by the way.
I was married to my first wife out there.
Oh, okay. So we know the area. We know the area where what you're talking about, and we know the personalities. But that was on top of the other trial coming for the boat accident and all of that stuff. I mean, this is a perfect storm that you just go, holy cow, are there any more rockets, coming downstream here that we should be aware of? Karen, what are your thoughts on?
Well, as with so many of these, I always feel like the victims get lost in so much of this,
Yeah.
And in this case, the victims were Murdaughs. So there you go. I'm not saying that's right. I mean, they are victims, and I just feel like there's so much with this case that's always all about Alec, right? This guy goes to prison, and just when you think it's safe to start moving on to something else, there's more news. It's like this constant stream of, shenanigans and, just stuff going on, whether it's women writing this guy love letters in prison, whether he's trying to, a
lot of them
favor by
he's
people by
hundreds.
buying canteen items. There's stories out there that other inmates have come out to the news and said, hey, this guy is spending his canteen money every week and buying up, candy, coffee, cigarettes, whatever they have, to win influence to people behind bars. I mean, it just doesn't stop with him. But all in all, there's victims. There's actually more than 2 victims here, as we well know. Yeah, this is about Maggie and Paul, but we still even there's so many questions about the Gloria Satterfield case, the Stephen Smith case. It goes on from there. And I just feel like, every time we talk about this, I felt that way, if we're going to do a little comparison in some small way with the O.J. Simpson trial, same thing. So much is lost, that the victims lost their lives. We're always talking about, the guy who's either behind bars right now for 2 consecutive life sentences with no parole, or somebody in O.J.'s case the jury decided he was not guilty.
I'll give you a quick anecdote. We touched on it just ever so slightly in the book, and it gives me an opportunity to brag on my wife just a little bit, and someone else that was part of the trial. We became friends with her. I call her Queenette. Her name is Net, and she was the one who's the victim's advocate in Colleton County there, and the chief deputy. So she was the one that would escort the family to and from. And one time she was in the elevator with John Marvin Murdaugh's wife. And John Marvin Murdaugh's wife, who is known as just a sweet Southern lady, was just tore up. She was very close to Maggie. And Becky had a fondness for John Marvin. He's not an attorney, just a business guy, just a nice guy. And she kind of broke down in the elevator, and Queenette prayed with her, and she thanked her. Not only then, but she wrote Net a handwritten note, and Melissa, my wife, framed it, and for Annette to have. And that's just an example that there are really real lives here. People did lost their lives. It's awful, but it stretch. And say what you want about Buster, I mean, he lost so much on that one night. He lost 3 key wonderful close people to him: his brother, his mom, and ostensibly his dad.
Yeah, and the system is going to have to work itself out, whatever that means, right? I mean, the system's in place, and everybody. I mean, the one thing I love about our audience is they're very savvy. They get it. I mean, Karen and I, we don't need 10,000, 15,000 people watching, right? The people that watch us know that we tell it the way it is, because that's the only way these platforms like this can be effective in telling the truth and advocating for victims, no matter whether or not it's a white hat or a black hat. It does not matter. The fact now, but once somebody is convicted and they're going through the appeals process, well, they're convicted. The jury, the system has worked, and it says you are a convicted murderer of these 2 individuals. Now, those ramifications, for the victim's advocate side, once the trial's over, the victim's advocate side is, you high five and everybody goes their different way. And trust me, in my career, I worked over 300 murders. And so I've seen a lot of families and a lot of victims advocates, and know for a fact that you cannot keep reliving in these people's lives, because your life will come to an abrupt halt, because you're constantly living it.
PTSD.
Correct. And my sweetheart will tell you, when I retired, I was driving and she looks at me and she goes, let's move. And I was like, what are you talking about? I'm not gonna go there right now, but it was like, what are you talking about? She goes, you haven't let go yet. And I let go of the steering wheel, and she's shaking her head. I let go of the steering wheel, looked over at her, and I said, where are we going? She goes, I don't know, but we'll figure it out. And we did. And wow. I let go. And the fact that this is constantly being stirred up by the same 2 guys in the courtroom that day, typically you would turn it over to an appellate attorney group and let them, take the fight on. But these, Jim's got his own podcast. I don't know what, Harpootlian
The
being
senator.
the senator. I mean, you can't make this up. Okay. Karen, what were you going to say?
No, he's an elected official, just like Becky Hill. Much different, though. Yes, she's an elected official. Dick is a legislator and has been for a very long time. And that surprised a lot of people that you can, be a defense attorney for, months and months, enmeshed and embroiled in that and still do your duties as a state senator. I'm just saying that's a reality. But yeah, he is.
That's right.
Yeah, I mean, you can't. I mean, this is no wonder you wrote a book. You can't make this stuff up.
You can't.
So I have a question for you, and I'm going to throw a curveball at you, but
Sure.
it's going to be a knuckleball. All right.
Phil Negro.
Okay, there you go. I'm not going to pull a Raleigh fingers on you. Okay. Okay. What is something you have not told any other show that you can share with our audience so that we can say you heard it here first with Neil, and then we're going to grab some questions.
Great.
And go from there. So give us something that you've not told anybody, Neil. That, I mean, you dropped a couple of them in here already, I think. But,
sure. I'll give you one, and I can't get too specific.
Okay.
We mentioned how apparently Dick and Jim mentioned how the jurors were angry. As much as Becky is beloved, this attention of this book and all that's occurred with all of these docuseries, and she's been asked to be interviewed on them as well. She's participated. She was in the Fox Nation one. She had members of her staff after the trial leave. There was some friction. People have this, it's so difficult. And for folks who've been in the military or understand a chain of command, sometimes people just get jealous and envious and resentful. And you mention and stir the pot. So maybe that's book number 2.
So what you're potentially telling us here is this isn't over, and there's going to be another, like this potentially coming, even from the court side.
I don't know. But it's just, if that's what just as beloved as Becky was by the judge, and you saw the attorney general, I don't know if you saw that wonderful press conference where he looked up, and Becky Boo, which is her personal email and what people tend to call her, as much as she is beloved, there are people that just, it was interesting, kind of like the fall of the Murdaughs. It's like you build people up, and some people take pleasure in pushing them down. So,
yeah, and in today's society, and social media has changed that dynamic. And really, really, sometimes in a positive way, but other times in a very destructive, emotional way. And we create more victims on the fallout of just that point. Karen, what were your thoughts on?
No, I agree. I mean, listen, we're no strangers to the vicious attacks and, that you see on social media. This is, I guess it's polarizing. I mean, there's got to be people who, are Alex Murdaugh fans and, all of that. But I think, at the end of the day, you can give the public the facts and they're going to make up they're going to make their own decision. I think with this whole matter, with these post-trial allegations, we don't have all the facts. All we heard were two criminal defense attorneys stand up and lob all this stuff, and there hasn't been a thorough investigation. And I think so many of us are like, well, let's go back and let's hear what has to be done. That evidentiary hearing needs to take place, not in the media, but within the courtroom, and let's get to the bottom of this. Are these two attorneys grandstanding and making these horrible accusations, or is there something to it? We just don't know right now. We don't know. But I tell you what, it's your book is helpful, and we're grateful that you came on the show and we're able to elaborate on a lot of these points and
Good.
Share with us your opinions, and it's been really good.
So,
you want to take
Kathy,
that question?
Yeah.
So,
was I surprised by the allegations of the defense team? Did I see it coming? I was surprised at the specific allegations. I was not surprised that it ended up happening, because there were murmurs that they were in town talking to jurors and possibly just trying to interview different people in town to get a sense of what went on during the trial. So I knew that they were kind of up to something. If that makes sense.
interesting. So uncivil law says Becky Hill can have as much presumption of innocence from me as Becky Hill gave Murdaugh. Seems only fair. So that's more of a comment than a statement. And thank you for that comment. Let's see here. Dana Tuso says, without the book, they had nothing for appeal, right?
No, I don't think it's fair to bring in the book at all. And I've been watching some pundits, and, again, we've poked holes in the motivation for what, Harpootlian and Griffin said, that, why Becky allegedly, would have tampered. So that's false. But the reality is, everyone has to allow time to pass and for the professionals to do the investigations and interview all the jurors, interview Becky if they do, and everything will come out. And it really has nothing to do with the book. But when you get attacked for, boy, if you wouldn't have wrote this book, then taxpayers wouldn't have to pay for a second trial, and people just go with their minds, they go everywhere. So.
Yeah, and here's another. The great thing about America is the First Amendment. One person has a comment, and another has the other side. Miss Becky deserves a medal for having to deal with the Murdaugh family of wealth and privilege. And,
I did want to say, like I told you, she really has had respect for John Marvin and Randy, who's an attorney. She loved Alex's dad. She learned, and we talked about that a little bit in the book. She's a pretty, like I mentioned, humble, reserved, gentle person. Well, she owes whatever her ability to come out of the shell handling a jury pool. Remember, she has to be the one to help conduct questions when they are deciding whether to eliminate jurors or not. She said she learned so much from Randolph and his ability in the courtroom, and that some of that rubbed off on Alex. And she actually gave, in the book Behind the Doors of Justice, she gave Alex some compliments for how he conducted himself in the courtroom. Just that certain ability where you hold jurors in the palm of your hand, or you're just the way that your personality, how you phrase things. Was I at the trial? No, I was not at the trial. And, my wife asked me if I wanted to come up there or whatever. And I told her, no, I've been there. I've done trials. I was at the Susan Smith just before the trial, the wake with the two little kids and the funeral, and it was enough for me. Again, small town South Carolina. But my wife was at the trial because, like so many people that couldn't focus on their work, she grabbed her friend. My wife's name is Melissa. She grabbed her friend Addie, who's a fellow photographer. They just went to Walterboro. We're 2 hours away. And she was in the courtroom for about a week. And then she was just chronicling and listening and getting little video snapshots and pictures. And she was there. And ironically, she had a family member 25 years ago who was an attorney who was on trial for being involved in murder, kind of a distant relative, and she sat in the courtroom. So this was the first time since then. She was fascinated by it. So she was my mobile news on tennis shoes, and she would report to me what she learned every day. So, but I was not there.
Neil, you reminded me of something in the book that I want to touch on, and then Chris, let's go back to that question that you just had up. But this kind of goes back to the motivation question, Neil. So in the book, Becky shared a story about how her granddaddy, and by the way, Becky is a multi-generational South Carolinian. Becky's grandpa and Alex Murdaugh's grandpa, back in the 1950s, ran some kind of a bootleg operation during Prohibition. Do I have that right, that it was the 50s? Or would it have been the 1920s?
No, it was the 50s. And I think there was a trial in 1956. And Becky's grandfather and Buster, she's getting her zoomies out behind me there. Buster Sr. Were acquitted. They were indicted, but they were acquitted. Now, what's so fascinating about this, he is a sitting solicitor in the 14th district.
Yeah, he was.
And Becky said, according to family members, he was acquitted, but they did together have involvement in a whiskey spill.
I just thought that was so interesting. You know, Becky is just about the same age as Alec. They, they share that story together. And I'm not implying Becky has any other, similarities with the Murdaughs.
Right.
But even throughout the book, she talked about this conflict, this internal conflict that she had with, doing her job, but also understanding kind of who the Murdaughs were in the community and her own personal, family lore that it did involve the Murdaughs too. And that's it's a thread throughout your book that I found quite interesting.
I did too. And I noticed some comments about the book, which are so kind. And someone gave us a shameless plug, but it's actually true. We're not a bestseller, like overall bestseller, but we are #1 bestseller in this category. It's called a white collar true crime category, true crime, murder, white collar. And so #1 seller. And I think it's 300th or 400th biggest bestseller in general. So, I mean, I'm not going to deny it. All of this stuff has created, which I'm so glad, it's created people who maybe have looked at what Dick Harpootlian and Jim Griffin did with the press conference, and it's made them think, maybe I need to check for myself what they're saying. Maybe I need to get this book and read a little bit and learn a little bit about Miss Becky and see what they can, because that's what why I think what psychologists have said about this trial in general. People want to be internet sleuths, and they also want to be able, it's like a puzzle. They want to be able to solve the puzzle and put the pieces together. And it's almost like they can't rest until they figure it out.
Yeah, no, I think they've done you a favor for sure to that question, that they've raised the the temperature of the book for sure. I mean, you're sitting here on our podcast
Sure.
because, we were, we always like to go, give the benefit of the doubt until we know, in
right.
terms of what the evidence shows. And, the evidence at this point has put, Alex in prison for killing two people. And at this now we're in the post phase of this where the defense attorneys are doing their job. They're trying to raise as many questions as they can, but unfortunately now they're pulling in, clerks. I can't think of a case I was ever on where a court clerk was ever questioned by the defense. And then there was a big press conference about it, after, a book had come out. I mean, I've not ever seen anything like this, to be honest with you. And we're seeing some of it, in the Korbarger case where they're using, in my opinion, they're using the motions process to talk to the public around the gag order. They're using motions, about DNA. They're using motions about, timelines and all this other stuff because they can't have a press conference. And so they're using the system and they're gaming the system. Whereas, a good defense attorney needs to just do their job and file motions. But when there's a gag order out there and they keep asking, to get things free, this is the same thing. I mean, you saw Griffin, you saw Harpullian, just pull things off in the courtroom. I had an aha moment when he walked in front of the expert testimony. Remember when he was walking around the courtroom? Who does that?
Right.
Chris, I want to ask Neil one of these questions that just popped up. It was a good question.
Sure.
And Becky mentioned this in one of her interviews that she did before the book came out. Did Alec get to pick the jurors? And if so, how did that happen?
I don't know the answer to that question. I know that they started with 900 summonses, and then they got an unusually high number of people to show up. I think it was 350. And Alex was there. He was there listening to Becky ask questions and ask the judge ask questions because, as you know, they're trying to find out whether there's any past relationship with Alex or if they're a single mom and it would be a hardship. And there's so many different ways to eliminate. So if he did, it was kind of like what happened in court. He might have been pulling the strings. So he very well could have said, I don't care for this juror or that juror. And, they get so many strikes.
Yeah.
But I will tell you, and Becky did mention this to me, and actually we did not get down too deep in the weeds on this part of it. Neither side used up all their strikes. There was actually a pretty good consensus of the jurors that they wanted. And it was very strange to me. A lot has been made of the fact that Becky's daughter almost was selected as a juror. And it's in the book. But there is a random system on how jurors are actually selected. So she was approved by both sides. And they both wanted to know, would your daughter be influenced at all by you or your dad or her current employer, who is I believe a former sheriff in the area? And Becky said, she's a redhead, and when she makes up her mind and is independent, she's independent. She would be a very good juror, and I believe she would have. And then, of course, you remember one of the key jurors, his brother was a key investigator on the case. And as a layperson, you wonder, well, how could this happen? Well, both sides, including Alex, gave the thumbs up, didn't strike him.
That's astounding to me, because to me, if a relative is on the jury, that's a conflict. So I'm glad that her daughter was never on the jury. Even,
I know.
I can't believe both sides said yes. That would have been crazy.
I'm thinking, I don't get it. Has the judge said anything about the book? We did not send material to every person that we talked about in the book, but out of great respect to Judge Newman, we sent the passages that involved him. And he gave us some more specifics, because it was not only his 40-year-old son that had just passed away, but it was 2 other relatives within a period of a month or 2. So he helped to kind of frame who they were for us and things like that. But he gave, here's the other thing. He never cautioned Becky. The Chief Justice of the state of South Carolina never cautioned Becky. She used the word blessed. They blessed it, not in any legal way, but just they just have such, they hold her in such high regard that, again, they understand the weight of this trial, and that it's almost a, for history's sake, to be able to just recant what was going on. It's like a snapshot in time.
Did Becky know Maggie? Maxine asked.
Not very well, but she had met her a few times. Now, Becky's doctor, and I can't recall his name, but he's in the book. Becky actually went and just had a regular doctor's appointment with her doctor and interviewed the doctor he allowed, because they were next door neighbors of Becky and Maggie in, I want to say Beaufort, if I'm not mistaken, but not in Walterboro or Colleton County, but they were neighbors at one of the, maybe it was Alameda, or one of the other homes that they have. And so he really liked Maggie and talked about Maggie, and thought in the book, mentioned that Alex really had, it was almost like, whoo, he was seeing Satan when he would see Alex around. And he felt bad for the kids, because there was not a tremendous amount of discipline.
Interesting. Sometimes in trials, before you answer this question here, sometimes in trials, there's a lot of stuff that takes place that the jury never hears, in some of the motions and stuff like that.
Mm-hmm.
Now that the trial's been adjudicated, do you have some of that stuff in the book?
About, I apologize.
No, that's all right. As Alex likes to call it, yip yap. Do you have any yip yap in the during when the jury's out and the attorneys are there, the judges there, the clerk's there, the bailiffs are there, and they're all yip yapping about stuff outside of the ears of the jury? You got any yip yap for us?
Oh, I see what you're saying.
I can answer part of that.
Go ahead.
No, but your stories are very much, the inside baseball type of things, but she's not, you don't relate conversations, let's say, between Creighton Waters, a comment to Jim Griffin. I'm just using that as an example. There's nothing like that in the book.
No, not to that. Although there was a lot of scuttlebutt out in the, in the lobbies and all sorts of things like that. And, when the jury was out, I mean, it for the first time during the 6 weeks for sure, and the entire time, it really hit Becky. She had to read the verdict, and she started to get very anxious and panicky. And she ended up calling a colleague of hers, who I mentioned she had talked to different colleagues in the planning phase. And she talked with her, and, she sort of talked Becky off the ledge. Becky was like, I don't think I can do this. She started to remember, knowing Alex as the attorney and the family and she started to really get out of her skin maybe as a clerk of court and as a human being. And it was just unsettling, but she prayed, she spoke on the phone. The flag was right outside her door, and she was just encouraged to do her job. And so that was kind of going on during that. There was a very tense period of everybody kind of waiting.
Okay, so we have a couple of traditions here. And the first one is when we get ready to wrap this up, you get the final word. So start thinking about what you would want to say, Neil.
Okay.
And then, in your opinion, Maxine asks, Neil, are the defense attorneys suffering a level of professional embarrassment losing the Murdaugh case? What's your opinion?
What a good question. Well, I mean, on the other end, they have a conviction that I do believe they think he's innocent, and he's deserving of the best counsel he can get. I mean, that's our country. And so I don't think they think they're embarrassed. I think they think they're fighting a good fight. I heard something recently that there's no more money left, that I guess it's almost pro bono right now. I don't know that to be true, but that's what I keep hearing. And I do visualize, though, Dick in his Mercedes going through the, dirt roads of Colleton County, knocking on the jurors' doors. That's a visual I don't know that I'll ever get out of my head. So.
Yeah, that was almost over your glasses, moment. It was an interesting moment. Karen, thoughts before we turn it over to Neil? And then, Neil, at the end of your comment, we have a tradition here with the second one is we go to Hawaii. So we play a really uplifting song. And your book, by the way, everybody, if you've just joined us, Neil's book with Becky, Neil's the co-author.
Right here.
Behind the Doors of Justice.
Justice.
It's available on Amazon. We're going to have the link below in our description. We just ask you here from the interview room, you help our channel by subscribing and sharing this on your social media networks, wherever they may be. We are grateful and would appreciate that
I'd be
very
happy
much.
to do that.
Okay. And our audience, if you've just joined us, we're so grateful. Karen, what are your thoughts,
I would just, again, thank you, Neil, for being here and to share this side of the story with everybody. We're grateful. And I'm going to let you get the final word here.
Okay, so I'm going to pull out. Whoops, hang on. I love you already, but hang on, buddy. and now here's the next question. Will you bring Miss Becky back when she's able to talk?
She recommended that I come on the podcast. Because again, women's intuition. She said, Neil, something about the interview room and the husband and wife team. I just really like them. And so I want to come on, and you should too. And so absolutely.
Wonderful. And so like you, I married way up with my Karen. So you get the final word, my friend. Have a good night.
My final word is, Becky's a friend of mine. Besides being a co-author, she's somebody that I look up to greatly. She is just unplugging all weekend. It's been exhausting, as you might imagine. And what I would encourage, if you get into conversations with your friends over the next several weeks, just encourage them to let the process out. Let the professionals do their thing, get all the interviews out of the way. Let SLED be involved, the FBI, whoever is going to be involved, because whatever happens in the dark will come to light. And rather than rush to judgment and be critical of why this happened or why that happened, just be patient. If Alex Murdaugh was granted an opportunity and the belief of being innocent until proven guilty, please allow that for my friend. I think it's only fair. And lastly, of course, if you have questions about what Dick Harpootlian and Jim Griffin happen to have mentioned at the press conference, it's Tuesday, September the 5th. I'm the co-author. My name's on the book, and he really he criticized. He said he wasn't going to do a book review, but he did. I would just encourage you to learn for yourself. You could actually, Becky has chosen not to speak right now to let the system play out, but she did the audio book of it. So if you want to hear from Becky, it's 4.5 hours, the whole book. You can order that on audiobook. There's Kindle, paperback, hardcover, and it's on Amazon, Behind the Doors of Justice. And to the McDougals, Karen and Chris, thank you so much for the opportunity and the ability to be fair and to balance things out. And I really appreciate it. And I hope everybody has a wonderful work week ahead. And again, thank you so much for having me on.
Hard working every day, I'm stressed out 24/7, babe. No timeouts, wish we could fly away. You and I go to our favorite place. Oh yeah, make special memories together. I'll be your company now and forever. I say we fly away, you and me, go to our favorite place. Feeling the sun on my face in Hawaii. With you, Hawaii. With you, Hawaii. With you, Hawaii. I need a summer breeze, some fresh air to put my mind at ease. No cares. You wanna come with me? Me and you go to our favorite tree. Are you ready now? We jump on a plane now. We're taking away. Yeah, we're taking away. Don't hesitate now. We're taking away. Yeah, we're taking away.